thevoicebeforethevoid.net. You know Ambrose Bierce?
I know the name. I can't.
Oh, Bierce is so awesome. Oh, he is one of my favorite writers ever. So interesting. He's American. He wrote several stories that are standards, like not even just classics, but standards. One of them, maybe the most standard-ish. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Do you know that one?
Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge?
At Owl Creek.
Oh, Owl Creek.
Yeah.
No.
It's a really famous story because it essentially, or at least for modern American or even storytelling, it's like the first or most famous instance of a type of story. I mean, I don't know if they're even called usually you'll hear it referred back to Owl Creek Bridge, and you'll find that structure of story in a lot of places, television, movies, other stories, novels, so on. And I'm sure, like most everything, almost everything is old. Like there's probably instances of it from, certainly. Well, I'm not certain, but I would just guess it must be from like ancient Chinese literature. But he wrote several other stories, like because he fought in the Civil War. Survived it, and then went to San Francisco. Spent a lot of time in the West, particularly in San Francisco. He was one of the most important literary people in the United States during his life. Wrote a lot of criticism. He was probably one of the most famous literary people. He wrote The Devil's Dictionary, which was largely humor. Most of his stuff has like humor in it. But he wrote a couple collections of Civil War stories, like short stories, and collections of supernatural stories. So his influence is just profound. Like he invented Carcosa, which came to influence like for weird fiction, like that is like the beginning of weird fiction almost. Since he had such an influence on Robert W. Chambers, who wrote a classic book, The King in Yellow. And then that, as well as Bierce's writings, particularly Carcosa, influenced Lovecraft, who then, made 20th century weird fiction and really horror. But some of Bierce's short stories, like his Civil War stories, are reprinted constantly in school textbooks for even grade school, for literature, for history. You've probably read them, or if I described them, you'd probably recognize them because a couple. What's that?
Whose?
Ambrose Bierce. Yeah, couple of his Civil War stories are just so famous because they really illustrated like the whole conflict. Yeah, A Horseman in the Sky. He wrote like his memoirs of the war as well, which is fascinating reading. He wrote a lot of stuff. Wrote a lot of criticism. Like he wrote about Jack London's books. He reviewed lots and lots of books for like the San Francisco Chronicle or whatever it was. Yeah, he wrote lots and lots of stuff. But anyway, a lot of his stuff is still read. And like I said, some of those Civil War stories are just almost every American ends up reading them because they are just good stories and they're just so emblematic. But also his weird fiction is just some of the best, including The Damned Thing. And even his life is so interesting because it was really interesting all the stuff he did, but then his thoughts, it was great reading. I read this one book of criticism by the primary Lovecraft scholar S.T. Yoshi, and it was a book. I think he called it The Weird Tale, where he traced like 6 different early writers of weird fiction, including Bierce, and then read their whole oeuvre, like just everything these guys wrote. I mean, the amount of reading he did for it's just massive. But he's a serious scholar. And it was a really interesting book to read too. And his pronouncement on Bierce was that Bierce was so original. He's just unlike any other writer, and that he essentially created his own genre, and then it died with his death, or his disappearance, actually, because no one else could really do it, or even to get what he did. He wrote a lot of poetry too. I mean, he was just all of stuff by Bierce I love. But the thing was, he was just so caustic, and so cynical in his attitude towards humanity. And that's really, like, the Devil's Dictionary really displays that. It's all done with humor, but he's essentially just making fun of everything in existence, or in human life. Not just making fun of it, but attacking and undermining it, and doing so very intelligently and wittily. And so that's the thing. You read his stories or anything, and it's like he attacks his audience, as he's telling the story, and does it just so smoothly. You could almost call him like not having like a use for life, really. But he was just so full of humor and real power in storytelling. And anyway, he disappeared. In approximately 1915, I guess, was the last he was heard from. He sent a letter back to San Francisco, because during the Mexican Revolution, he went into northern Mexico to just write about what was going on. He went looking for Pancho Villa, and it's not known if he ever found him or not, because he just disappeared in Mexico, and there is no conclusive evidence for what happened to him. There's just stories that have, appeared, but that's all they've ever been, is stories. There's no documentation anywhere. There's no remains. He just vanished. And of all, he wrote so many weird stories that, involve stuff like that. And then for himself to have actually just be gone without anyone really knowing what happened to him is so, he made his life, because he was old. He was really old when he went. He lived a long life, and then he fought in the Civil War, so that's in the 60s. And then, in 1915, he goes to Mexico. He was an old man. And he just disappeared. And actually, I think that one Mexican novelist, really prominent Mexican novelist, he wrote, one of his novels is just about Bierce disappearing in Mexico. I think it's called El Gringo. El Gringo Viajo. And they filmed it many years ago. But I think there's been other stories. Well, he appears in lots of, kind of supernatural stuff, TV shows and fiction, because he's such an interesting character himself. His work is so important, and the fact that he disappeared. Yeah. So anyway, that's Ambrose Bierce.